Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Defund the police. It's a bold demand from protesters, advocates, and even some politicians fed up with the senseless killings by police of racialized people in the United States and here in Canada. But what does defund the police actually mean? And is it even possible? Well, tonight we're going to explore that. Then we'll find out what data shows about the relationship between police unionization and civilian deaths. It is Wednesday, June the 17th, 2020, and that's all ahead on the agenda. Calls to change policing are not new. Pressure for major reform is also not new. But particularly since the killing of George Floyd by police in Minnesota last month, a potentially much bigger demand has come to the fore. Defund the police. With us to explain what that means and offer some idea of how it might play out in practice, we are joined in Midtown Toronto by Lori-Ann Thomas, criminal lawyer, president of Thomas Defense, and an instructor in the Ryerson University Law Practice Program. In downtown Toronto, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. And in Lawrence Park in North Toronto, there's former Ontario Attorney General Michael Bryant, now executive director and general counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And it's great to have you three alongside today for what is, if it's not the topic of the week, month, and year, it sure is pretty close to it. Yeah. I think we need to start by just understanding what we're talking about and maybe what we're not talking about, because defunding the police, as we're discovering, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we thought we'd start by just, Tony Burke, if you could, just bring up this picture of this flyer. This is being seen in neighborhoods all around Toronto, and it is one person's interpretation of what it means: disarm, defund, diminish, abolish. That's what defund the police means to the person who printed up these leaflets. Lori, why don't we start with you? Is that what defund the police means to you?
Not quite. I mean, I think that realistically, we're not going to be getting rid of the police. The police have a very good purpose for the community. So we can't say, when we say defund, we don't mean get rid of them entirely. What we do mean, or at least what I would mean, and what I took it to mean, is that it means maybe reallocating the funds that go to the police to preventative measures, to other agencies, where you're not spending the money on dealing with police interactions, you're spending the money on avoiding police interactions. So to me, that means with funding at-risk neighborhoods, it means funding mental health facilities and agencies to help people who are suffering in the community to not have to worry about being engaged in with the police when they're at their, in a mental health crisis. In my opinion, it really does mean really looking at where we're spending the money, how we're spending the money, and if there's ways to do it which avoid spending the money on at the worst point, as opposed to dealing with it in a preventative measure.
Akwasi, does this poster sum up your views on what defund the police means?
So not the abolition part. I think there are some arguments to be made for police abolition, but that's not what I see here. I do see, potential for drastic reform and a reimagining of what it is that we have the police doing. For me, defunding the police really means reassigning tasks and responsibilities that we currently have the police performing to organizations, institutions, and agencies that are better situated to perform those tasks. And along with that, and here's the funding part, a reallocation of the funds that we're currently giving the police to perform those tasks that they perhaps don't do so well, or that there are negative outcomes associated with their involvement in, to organizations, agencies, institutions who are better equipped to perform those functions. And if those agencies, organizations, or institutions don't currently exist, creating ones that do to perform those roles and those jobs for us.
Michael Bryant, how do you interpret that slogan?
Well, I'm a little bit, I should say, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, their view is very much aligned with our last two viewers. I would say, and I would try and push my organization to something a little closer to what that poster looks like in terms of disarming and also changing the amount of power that police have and the powers that they do have, and democratizing this in a way that I don't, I agree that this isn't the first time we've been talking about policing and how it's done, but I don't remember I don't remember discussion of defunding in the past. And to me, defunding means a real, actual, you could say radical change, but just an actual change instead of more of the same. And the same has basically all been about, I think, changes around the margins, and many people want more policing. That's what they want. I mean, really, that's what the budget conversations and the political conversations are all about, is how to crack down on crime. What this defunding debate opens up is the idea that, hey, maybe we don't have a crime problem in Canada like we think we do, and I would agree with that. And maybe the way to deal with whatever our social situation in Canada is to have different actors involved, and that's certainly consistent with what we've heard so far in the show, which is to say, less people with guns showing up at wellness checks, and more people equipped for those situations showing up to be of aid to people, instead of inevitably really sending in the military. That's what the police are. They're a completely militarized operation, and we're talking about demilitarizing a lot of policing in Canada.
We're going to talk more about that demilitarization angle as we continue our conversation. But Akwasi, I'm sure there are people watching this right now, maybe the person who printed up those posters, for example, who believe that defunding the police means taking all their money away, in essence, to shut them down. As in, they've done such a poor job, we just have to completely shut them down and start again from scratch. Is that possible or even desirable?
I think, we could imagine a world where we don't have police as we know them now. We have, another institution, or as Michael said, a democratization of this process. Like, if we think about the evolution of policing, like a public safety and security function is something that's been performed by groups of people for centuries, if not millennia now, really. Like a couple of thousand years, people have been coming together in increasingly formalized ways to protect themselves and to protect those around them. So really what we're seeing here is we've got to a point now where this function is being performed by institutions that aren't necessarily best serving certain segments of our society. And so we're seeing a rolling back, or a desire to roll some of that back. And so again, I think we can think about, and we will talk about some of the models that might replace what we have now. And these calls for defunding the police are coming from certain segments of society. There's certainly been discussion for a long time about police budgets and about the role and function of the police. And many of these are coming from within policing as well. When we look at some of the issues that police officers face with respect to health and mental health, a large part of the stress on police officers is their performing of functions that they don't necessarily feel that they're best equipped to perform. So, when we think about the level of crime in our society, we think about dangerousness, someone that works in construction in Ontario is more likely to be harmed on the job by a police officer. But the sad fact is, a police officer is more likely to harm themselves with their own service weapon than they are to be harmed by a member of the public. And so I think encapsulating part of this discussion must be, perspectives of police officers with respect to the roles and functions that they feel that they're best suited to perform, and how they can best add to public safety as well.
Laurie, as a criminal defense attorney, I'm guessing that you spend a good chunk of your day dealing with the police, interacting with police officers on a regular basis. Just give us some of the flavor of how that works out.
So, my interactions for the most part with police are in court, and usually in the area of cross-examination, though I do deal with them whenever my clients get arrested. The interaction with the police that I have in court can vary. Most of the time it's pretty positive or neutral in terms of dealing with them. We're all in a professional setting. What I find is that, the thought of this dramatic cross-examination that tends to be in movies and TV is not quite the same way in terms of our interactions with police in the hallways. And so it's for the most part positive, because the truth is we're all doing our job professionally. The times that we have issues are when we have and I certainly would be the one that knows of it first, which is issues where they've breached charter rights, or have used excessive force. And so that's where the conversations or my cross-examination is going to be more difficult, and those interactions are going to be less comfortable for them.
Can I just jump in here with a follow-up? Do
Sure.
they, generally speaking, do you believe they perform their jobs professionally?
I would say the most do, but there are definitely consistent problems that happen. I do hear of excessive force. I do hear a significant amount of rights being broken, in terms of them using, as Michael said, their military kind of appearance, to kind of take control of a situation. Also does it in a way that that prevents anyone from actually knowing what their rights are, or even using their rights. And I know my personal self, I've had, outside of being a lawyer, I've had interaction with the police where I know my rights. I know that I don't have to speak, but when there's an officer with the lights on you, you respond accordingly. So they come to you as you would in war. That's what it feels like when you have a police interaction that is uncomfortable. So that's something that people of color experience all the time. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that there are problems, that there are bad apples, and the reason why that saying of there's only a few bad apples, it spoils a bunch. And so that's the one thing that I think needs to be addressed is, what do you do with the officers, the officers that don't do their job professionally, don't do it ethically? They need to be excised out of the force, because they are ruining it for the officers who do their job professionally. They are the ones that are spoiling the bunch. And so those are kind of some of the concerns I have. And then, of course, sadly, what I notice consistently, and any defense lawyer would tell you, is that there's a problem with even with theft of money or drugs or what have you during executions of warrants, those kind of things.
Follow up on that. What does that mean?
So anytime somebody goes anytime a group of police officers go in, they all go separate. And so there's some, unfortunately, I find it consistent where clients complain, and I'm not alone, and that more money was taken than was there, than reported, that there was some more drugs that were there. And so there is a problem in that area too. But there's also a protection. So it's very hard to get out unless somebody testifies and says, I had more money and drugs than they said. It's hard to kind of expose that as a defense lawyer. We do our best to do that. And you'll see, many defense lawyers have done it successfully, but those officers need to be addressed, because there are many that are just trying to do their job right and go home at the end of the day.
Yeah, I guess you're not going to say, actually, Your Honor, my client stole $10,000, not just $5,000. That's probably not a great defense. I get it. Okay.
Exactly.
Michael Bryant, let me get you back in here on this. You were Attorney General. Gosh, how long ago was it? It's
2003 to 2007.
I was going to say 16, 17 years ago already, right? Is Ontario, based on your knowledge and based on what you're learning today, is it a safe province compared to other places?
Oh, yeah. 100%. We're a very, very safe province, very safe country. The rates of death by accident and suicide are a lot more than, for example, homicide. For every homicide in Canada, there are 10 suicides. So that suggests to me that we've got a bigger suicide and mental illness issue then we have an issue of public safety, and
maybe I should jump in with the clarifying follow-up, which is the answer you just gave the same for everyone or only white people?
Yeah, no, and this is the problem, is to say that we have disastrous community relations between the police and and Black people and Indigenous people and racialized minorities is, an understatement. It is a disaster, and it's reflected in the charges that are laid, and it's reflected in the number of charges that are laid and who they're laid against, and they're all laid against, not all, they are disproportionately laid against Black people, Indigenous people, and racialized minorities. And in many cases, these charges are just garbage charges, and yet they fill up the system, and the system feeds itself in a way that I certainly didn't see when I was Attorney General, and that's obviously a failure on my part. And I should say on that front, when we're talking about police, really, to be clear, I think the accountability has to rest with the people who are held accountable by the electorate. And, that's got to be the ministers of public safety, the premiers, and the prime minister to some extent, but policing is mostly municipal and provincial, and the mayors. My goodness, that the mayors are not held accountable for their police forces is mystifying to me. And these are the people who are making the decision and ultimately accountable for what the police are doing and how many there are. And, I think we can talk about whether or not it makes sense that we have more police per capita in Canada than is the case in China, or that we have comparable levels of police per capita than we have in the United States, which is why the defunding conversation is helpful to frame it in terms of how serious I think the public is about this.
Well, let me follow up on that accountability angle with Akwasi, because I guess part of the difficulty here is, Michael Bryant's quite right. The mayor of Toronto sits on the police services board. He was elected citywide. He has a great deal, you would think, of influence on how police do their jobs. The Premier of Ontario and the Solicitor General, of course, have a say in choosing who the head of the Ontario Provincial Police is. But the Police Services Board are the ones who technically oversee the police service of this capital city and every other city in this province that has its own police force. So who do you complain to? Who's ultimately accountable when there's a problem with the police?
Well, and I've got to agree with Michael with respect to our elected officials, because ultimately, police service boards are at least partly populated by people who are appointed, for example, by the province. So we absolutely need to keep our elected officials to account here. And, there are a number of factors. I think Michael's raised another point. There are, the police have multiple audiences and multiple constituencies as well, right? So these calls for defunding the police are largely coming from populations who are over-policed and who experience violence and other forms of poor policing. And perhaps increasingly, but historically, they've been less so from the people who feel that they're protected by the police and actually perhaps like the police going out and, practicing aggressive forms of policing in our disadvantaged neighborhoods. So that also needs to be acknowledged. So we need to, hold our citizenry, our peers accountable as well with respect to the level of support that they give for certain types of policing practices. And I think something that's important to note as well that was just raised by Michael with respect to police strength is, and I took a look at the numbers again last night in preparation for the show, there's no clear relationship in Canada, as there aren't in other places, between police strength and rates of crime. I'll say that again. There's no clear relationship between police strength, so either the number of police officers or the ratio of police officers per 100,000 population, and levels of crime. We know that policing tactics, patrol methods, and even patrol methods that don't include armed police officers can have an influence on crime rates in a jurisdiction. So, in the context of our conversation about defunding the police, it's again thinking about how we can have the police that we have now work smarter and more efficiently, and what other models of policing we can tack on to that.
But Laurie, I'm assuming the police would argue that, as Michael Bryant said just a few minutes ago, if we have, relatively speaking, one of the safest jurisdictions in the world here in the province of Ontario, wouldn't the police be allowed to say one of the reasons for that is because we do our jobs well, we exist in a satisfactorily large enough number to ensure that we can do our jobs well, and therefore, if we put everything into perspective, we should remember that.
Well, I think that may or may not be true, but the main issue is that perhaps in my neighborhood, I don't see the police on a regular basis, but in other areas, in lower economically situated areas, they may see the police quite a bit, but sadly, they're not trusting relationships. So their interactions with the police are different than mine in my own neighborhood would be. And so I think that you have to reassess at how you look at that, and is that helping? Because one of the complaints that we hear is when there are violent issues in certain areas, there isn't that trusting relationship with the police. So you don't have people coming forward to the police because unfortunately it hasn't been built. There should be other avenues where you're not over policing areas, and but what you're doing is you're actually you're taking care of the underlying problems that bring police interactions to those areas. So again, dealing with the crisis before it happens, finding other avenues. So to me, I still think that it's more important to fund other institutions, other agencies to address the underlying issues that bring the over policing in certain areas. My area is not an issue, but others are, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. And certainly many of your viewers will say, I don't see the police on a day-to-day basis, but other areas, other neighborhoods see them consistently throughout the day, and they're not friendly interactions. They may be neutral, but at a certain point, if you see militarized people walking through your neighborhood, it doesn't feel like home, and it doesn't feel like you're safe.
Well, let's return to that angle of the militarization of the police that Michael brought up earlier, and this is a good time to revisit that here. There is surely a big difference between seeing two police officers on bicycles, perhaps on a day like today in short pants, cycling around a neighborhood, just keeping an eye on things and creating a presence, as if to say, we're here and we're part of the community and we're just doing our jobs. And then what people in Toronto saw 10 years ago this month, I think, where there were police that looked like armies from fascistic countries trying to kettle people and beat lots of people up and arrest lots of people that they shouldn't have done. And I guess I'm wondering, Michael, why don't you start us off here? Why did somebody decide, and I guess it was several years ago, that the police had to look like military units some of the time when they were doing their jobs in cities?
I think it's about power. I think it's about abuse of power, but certainly it's about the police trying to get the power and to be seen to have the power, that they would be able to dominate a situation and dominate people. So it meant that when the police chiefs would go to their boards or ministries and seek to get the equipment to deal with situations, comparing a procurement in Toronto, for example, to a procurement in Chicago, as if those were similar cities in terms of the levels of crime, and they're not. So again, these are all accountable decisions made about transforming people who may at one time have been, as you suggest, members of the community. We think of the sheriff as the Americanized example, but the militarized version is straight out of a video game, and there's a real point to that. It's a point of intimidation. It's an effort to intimidate and exert power through the idea that that's going to take a chaotic situation and bring it under control. I mean, it's entirely taken right out of the pages of the military. And the problem is where this is operating. Again, same thing in the constituency that I used to represent in Midtown Toronto. Our crime rates were extremely low, but just south of there, community like the homeless community near Yonge and Bloor, there's a homeless drop-in center near there. We tried to get the police to come unarmed to the drop-ins, just to meet the community, to become part of the community, unarmed in civilian clothes. The answer was always no. They'd send, a community services officer to stand in the parking lot and meet some people. That's the problem. It's this divide between us and them, and there's just no interest, realistically, in military civilianizing themselves. But that's really, I guess, maybe when we talk about defunding, that's what we're talking about, is civilizing the police in Canada.
Kwasi, do you think there are circumstances where it is legitimate for the police to show up in massive numbers with, riot gear, nightsticks, helmets, clad completely in, in the kind of clothing that looks rather intimidating if you're just intending to be a peaceful protester? Do you think there is a call for police services to have that capability?
I think theoretically we're going to want the police to be able to respond to situations with at least equal, if not increased force, right? If the reason that we have police in a society is to keep members of that society safe, then they will need to be able to respond to threats to that society, whatever that might mean. Now, I think, the problem is that too often the case, we have this show of force, as Michael's talked about, and we've had this increasing militarization of the police, and so they respond not only to protests, but I think about the sweeps that often take place in our more marginalized neighborhoods, the tactical equipment, the heavily armed officers, the flashbang grenades that go off as police across North America raid the homes of people who've been accused of a variety of crimes. Sometimes they get the wrong homes and people end up dying, as we've recently seen. Oftentimes they get the wrong homes, Sometimes we see people dying, but we certainly see the traumatizing of young children and family members who are in those houses when the police go into arrest crime suspects. So, I think we can talk about the police presence on the streets, but we also need to talk about the police presence literally in people's homes. And, the militarization of policing has come in part as a response to declarations of a war on crime and a war on drugs. And anytime you have a war on something, of course, you need to have an enemy. And so a large part of this conversation is coming because there's been an enemy identified within our society. Too often they are a young racialized male, and we see the detriment, we see the negative impacts of their criminalization and their vilification in terms of how society as a whole looks at them, right? This is why we have the shooting of unarmed Black men, because of the threat that they're perceived to be, which has come as a direct result of the war on drugs and the war on crime.
Laurie, if there were systemic, deep retraining, repurposing, rethinking about what the role of policing is, do you think the police services around this province are capable of doing that?
I think that they are capable of doing it. I think that the people the elected officials, the police chiefs, they have to believe that it is possible, and you have to get the buy-in. I mean, politicians are so good at getting people to buy in. So you have to get the buy-in for these police forces to say, this is better for you. It is safer. Like, I can only imagine that for a police officer, and I've seen it many times, where police officers go and deal with mental health issues, people who are suffering from mental illness, and they don't know if the person is dangerous or not, but because they haven't had any interaction with this person. There are other agencies like ACT, which is the Assertive Community Treatment Team, which would really who maintain a relationship with those who are suffering from mental illness in the community, and so they would know exactly what the police are doing it with. And I've been in other jurisdictions. I mean, Owen Sound, for example, is a jurisdiction where the police and the ACT team really work well together, and the police know who their citizens are. They know who's in the community, and they work together. And so there's a more trusting relationship between the community and others. Owen Sound, unfortunately, is not a racialized, for the most part, community. So why not mimic that into other areas? There's no reason why Toronto or other large jurisdictions can't have the same relationship with their police. You just have to change kind of the old thinking and say status quo isn't working for anyone. police or to the community. So how can we do it better so police don't have to feel like they're defending themselves from doing an honest day's work, and those who in the community can feel safe with the police that they're dealing with?
In which case, this next question is a perfect one, I hope, for a former attorney general. I'd like to know, Michael Bryant, how this could actually happen. You're the attorney general, you're the solicitor general, whatever. You're at the next cabinet meeting. How does the idea of defunding the police, not in terms of abolishing the police, but in terms of the way you three have described it off the top of our conversation, how does that discussion get had at the cabinet table, get some legs, and actually happen?
You need to change legislation so that you, amongst other things, change the charging process. I would follow the BC and Quebec model, where the Crown attorneys, the prosecutors lay charges as opposed to the police. Take that power off the table, because that, as long as that power is on the table, then you've got a situation where it's always going to be about that. Is there going to be a charge laid or not? And I think that needs to be done differently, because we've just had nothing but overcharging, at least in this province. Secondly, I would just take a portion of the public safety budget and I'd send it right over to the Ministry of Health, and I would work with the Ministry of Social Services to put together the equivalent of an ACT team, but other interventions and community liaison opportunities that allow for people embedded in the community who are a part of the community to be a part of assisting those people's lives, instead of having the military being sent over. I don't believe that you can do it through the Ministry of Public Safety. I think it's too militarized from top to bottom. And so you need to take it out and put it in the healthcare system, because that's really what we're talking about, I think, in terms of mental illness, is caring for people's health. And when I think about, all the people in pain on the streets, and the fact that their frontline contact with the state, it's always the same. It's the police. And for those people in pain, it's not the police they need. They need care. They need help. And I just don't think the police can deliver it. I think that has to be delivered by a different group of people with a different mindset and a different purpose. And that is to heal, as opposed to charge, convict, prosecute, etc. I think that's the way you do it.
Well, Akwasi, let me state the obvious here. Every government, regardless of stripe, and it's certainly easier for a conservative government, which we have now in Ontario, but I do recall the Dalton McGuinty Liberals with Michael Bryant there also trying to establish good links and good relationships with the police services around the province. They all want to curry favor with police services. They want to look like they are at peace with the police, at the very least, if not allies with the police. So how do you do what Michael Bryant just said? Keep your relationships with the police sound, and at the same time, deal with the blowback you will get, because every institution wants to defend itself, and the police are quite expert at defending their budgets. How do you make all that happen?
Absolutely. From the policing perspective, I think we make this about officer wellness, right? Like, we have a mental health crisis within the ranks of policing as well. And that ought to be, and it's increasingly being recognized. So if this, from the policing perspective, is positioned as a way in which officers can go about doing the work that they're well equipped to, well trained, and well positioned to do, and not confronting, let's be honest, the police confront horrible environments and horrible instances on a daily basis, right? There's a lot of trauma that goes along with policing. And so if we can remove some of those elements from the work that they do and have them better supported, I think, from the policing perspective, that's a positive thing. I think, we've got the protection of budgets from police services and perhaps their boards, and then we need to look at the role of associations as well, right? And so the associations are there as well to protect the interests of their members, and those interests shouldn't just be ensuring that their funding stays the same or continues to grow. It should be ensuring that their officers are healthy and able to go to work each day. And so I think getting the associations on side here too is important.
Laurie, the Premier, of course, has a daily briefing, and he was asked, I think a few days ago, what do you think about the notion of defund the police? Now, my hunch is Premier Ford didn't really understand what that expression meant in the nuanced way that you've all presented here today. My hunch is he interpreted it as a let's take all the money away and shut down the police entirely. So, of course, he said he was against that. But we know from his past statements that Premier Ford, certainly feels in league with the police. He sees them as allies. He believes it's important to have a strong relationship between his government and the police services around the province, in particular, the Ontario Provincial Police. I guess the question is, can you imagine some form of defunding the police happening under the current administration?
I will say I will give this current administration, as I would anyone, the credit to really look at what the issues are, and certainly, a 2-word statement, defund the police, or 3 words, defund the police, is catchy, but is not exactly policy making. So I would hope that that this government would also look at, okay, what's going on with our frontline staff? Do they need to put themselves in a situation where they're not equipped? And is this an ideal way to support the police? In my opinion, it's really not. It's putting them in a situation where they are essentially helpless, but they're told that they're supposed to fix it, but they don't have the real training and the tools necessary to do this. So to me, I think that this government can do it. They just have to look at it in a different way, and maybe they won't refer to it as defund the police, but maybe there's another way they can say, we're going to reallocate, look at our health system. They certainly understand the importance of our health system in a pandemic. I think we're all aware that in addition to the pandemic, mental illness is going to also be something that we'll be dealing with, is the after effects. And so there's something where they can spend the money on the health system and not just on the police.
That was a great and illuminating discussion. Thanks to Lori-Ann Thomas, Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, and Michael Bryant for joining us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The death of civilians in police custody has perhaps never been as front and center as it is right now. And what to do about it has never been as prominent in our public conversation. But do we have the right kind of information that policymakers need to act and get it right? Rob Gillezeau is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Victoria. He went looking for just such data, and what he found was not exactly inspiring. And he joins us now from Victoria, British Columbia, to explain. Professor, it's good to see you. How are you managing through this pandemic?
We're getting by. The toddler finally just went back to childcare, so getting a little bit of work done now.
I hear that a lot. Childcare centers reopening is a absolute celebration, a reason for celebration, absolutely. You founded something, as we get into this, called the Racial Uprisings Lab. Just explain what that's all about, if you would.
Yeah, so I do a lot of my research at the intersection of race, protest, and police violence. And so I started doing that work, looking at the uprisings that happened in the 1960s. And those were uprisings that happened in response to largely police brutality, police violence against African-American civilians. So that data already existed. And, historical information is valuable. But we wanted to know, what is happening with protests today? And is protest today working? And that data didn't exist. So my colleague Jamie Cunningham and I, he's at the University of Memphis, we founded a lab with the goal of digitizing all major racial protest in the United States from 1990 all the way up to 2017.
You say only in the United States. Canada's not part of this?
It is not. That is somewhere that we would love to jump into. But even if we collect, for example, if we collected data on I Don't Know More, something that I very much want to do as a Métis person, I don't have data I can link that up to, right? I can capture when and where the protest happens, but I can't necessarily link it to outcomes in the Canadian context because that data isn't there.
What got you interested in studying this to begin with?
I'm an economist who believes in studying my community, studying things that my neighbors care about. And I did my doctoral studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I love Michigan. I grew up in Ontario. Michigan felt very much like home, but things were tough there. Detroit is a city I love, and I'd spend a lot of time there as a graduate student. But things were tough, and I think everyone everyone knew that some of the difficulties went back, right, to some of those difficult times in the 1960s. And I was there, living there for the 40th anniversary of the uprising in 1967. And, I wanted to know how these huge uprisings happened, right? People stood up and said no to police violence. And in many cases, right, the result was that their own communities were damaged and burnt down. But that was done to send a message about the unacceptability of police violence. And so I wanted to study, did those uprisings work? Did they send that message, and was it acted on? And unfortunately, our results showed the opposite happened. Rather than leading to a decrease in police violence, officers responded to these protests in the 60s by actually killing more civilians in the years following.
Well, that, of course, was decades ago. And I have to believe that, given your interest in this subject area, you must be watching what's unfolding over the last few weeks across North America with, perhaps a tremendous professional interest and considerable personal angst and concern. But that's me putting words in your mouth. Why don't you tell us how you're feeling about it all?
I mean, over 1,000 civilians are killed a year by the police in the United States, and they're overwhelmingly people of color. I think things feel different this time. It is horrifying. It is horrifying every single time it happens. But to have 10 minutes of footage, I think it caused the public to take notice in a way that they haven't before. And the protests that we're seeing sweeping, not just the United States, not just Canada, but the world, right, are the biggest we've seen since the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. King. Right, this is an unprecedented level of protest, and media is covering it in a way like they never have before, in a way that, as a researcher, is fascinating, but as a human being, gives me enormous hope that maybe things are going to be different this time.
Rob, you have written a paper, which I gather has not yet been published, but it's called "The Impact of Access to Collective Bargaining Rights on Policing and Civilian Deaths." Bit of a mouthful there, but obviously hugely prescient given the times in which we live. Tell us about that paper and its findings.
Yeah, so I did that early work on protests and police violence, and we found that was a part of the story, but it really was just a part of the story. And the United States, right, has seen this huge increase in civilians killed by officers over the last half century, and so a popular notion, right, that you would hear when I was living in the United States, and that you hear north of the border too, is that, right, police unions play this role in limiting accountability for officers who engage in crimes against civilians, who kill civilians, who hurt civilians. And so we took a look around, and there really wasn't much evidence there. There is one nice paper by a team out of the University of Chicago who have found some evidence with respect to brutality in Florida, but that was pretty much it. And so we said, we can't go out and get every collective agreement, but what we can do is we can look at when collective bargaining rights are granted to police, starting in the late 1950s, continuing through the 1980s, and we can figure out, how do they change their behavior when they get access to those bargaining rights?
I want to be careful how I ask this next question because I don't want it to sound insensitive, but I guess the fact is that unions, part of their job is to protect their membership, A, from capricious management, but also B, they do a lot of defending of, teacher unions, for example, often defend bad teachers from getting fired. Journalist unions prevent bad journalists from getting fired. That's just sort of part of the mandate. What's the difference between what police unions do on behalf of police officers who may be bad?
Yeah, and I want to be upfront. I'm a union member right now. I'm on the executive for my faculty union. I believe that collective bargaining is a right. So we have some pretty troubling findings in this paper, but those findings don't say that people shouldn't have that ability to bargain. What's happening differently, you have the duty of fair representation that you referred to, right? The union has an obligation to represent its members, and that's a legal obligation. But what are police unions doing? There are bargaining elements of collective agreements that in essence create a parallel justice system that officers face. So for example, this can include if an officer is involved in the killing of a civilian, you would like to think that they would go and give a statement pretty rapidly and they would be interrogated. often these agreements include clauses that will require the officer to agree to the time and location when that statement could occur, delaying it. It might guarantee a right to huddle with other officers on the scene to talk about what happened, and it might even dictate what can happen in that room. It might, for example, require breaks every 20 minutes. It might limit the type of questioning that can occur. So it fundamentally shifts accountability within the system in a way that is much more beyond what you would normally see in the collective bargaining process.
Do you know whether or not that takes place in the province of Ontario? For example, if the Special Investigation Unit is investigating a police shooting, do you know whether, for example, the Ontario Provincial Police Union or the Toronto Police Association, whether they have the powers you just enumerated to affect the investigation that way?
So I haven't looked at those contracts recently for Toronto. In general, in the Canadian context, there is, again, a different system. It's usually articulated not in the collective agreement, but rather in the Police Act. So, for example, in British Columbia, the Police Act is going to lay out a process of investigation. The collective agreement will mainly say something relevant in a way that will shift behavior with respect to indemnification, right? Officers certainly will have their costs covered going through this process. And so one of the main areas for reform we're hearing in the United States that would work very well in Canada would be applying, right, basically officers themselves taking on some liability, such that if you repeatedly engage in violent acts against the public, your insurance costs would go up. So there's that little bit of overlap, but there are differences across the border.
Okay. And again, I want to make sure that I'm super clear about the way I ask this question, but do you see a correlation between police unionization and increasing civilian death?
Yeah, so, we do, and it is significant, and it differs by race. Our prior, when we went into this research, was that when officers gained access to collective bargaining, and I want to be precise that we're looking at the impact of getting bargaining rights rather than just forming the union, and that this is about both sides of the table. So when we went in, we thought, what's going to happen, right? There are these situations where an officer is making the decision to shoot. And on one hand, right, their personal safety is a concern, and that leans towards shooting in a situation under which they're unsure. On the other hand, right, if they shoot someone who is unarmed, they could face consequences. And so, right, at that margin, having a union, having things that protect the officer is going to shift the decision to shoot. But if that's all that's occurring, right, we would expect more civilians, regardless of race, to be killed. What do we actually find? We find that there is no change in the number of white civilians being killed by officers, but an additional 0.029 non-white civilians per year per county in the United States. So that's about 60 to 70 per year, but jumping back in time to the 1960s and 70s, are being killed annually because of that change in bargaining rights. And that's a really, really big effect.
Okay, well, again, just because there is a correlation doesn't mean that their unionization directly caused the civil deaths that you talked about, right? Just so I'm clear, are you saying it was a contributing factor, but not necessarily the cause of those deaths?
So economists today spend a lot of time on identification, and we're willing to make the causal claim here. Because what do? We look at, right, timing changes when bargaining rights are introduced state by state, but then we actually narrow in on counties. And we say, we have this county at the border of Michigan and Ohio, one in Michigan, one in Ohio, and the law flips in one state. How do things change within that county pair? So we're using an extremely precise control group to get causal estimation here. So I wouldn't just frame it as correlation. It does look causal. Now, but I think maybe the core of your question, what's the mechanism, right? Because it's not necessarily the union that's causing it, right? This is probably the result of a process, right? Bargaining is a two-way street. It is measures in the collective agreement that are likely causing these effects. But the collective agreement is owned just as much by the employer as it is by the union.
Do you think the unionization of police services across North America has led to safer working conditions for police officers? Because I don't have to tell you, we also, in police officers I've interviewed over the years, say that they occupy one of the few jobs in this society where when you walk out the front door, you never really know if you're coming home that night. So let's focus on that for a second.
Yeah, so we're actually able to test that, and we don't see any change in the number of officers being killed in the line of duty. And that was a surprising result, because my prior had been, we would have seen a modest decrease. But it looks like other factors relating to the increased use of force may actually be putting some additional risk onto officers that counterbalance anything else going on. I want to be clear that that's a very narrow estimation, right? I'm not testing, for example, whether or not officers are less likely to be injured. And I would be surprised, right, if the bargaining process wasn't resulting in some additional protection for officers.
What changes might be made to the way police unions function to make them work better for everybody?
Yeah, to be honest, I think that both sides have an obligation to do better here. And I actually turn to the employer first. Because, right, when you're sitting down at that bargaining table, who's usually the employer, especially in the United States, but in Canada too, right, it's typically going to be local government. And, right, you're going to bargain over wages, you're going to bargain over pensions, other benefits, you're going to bargain over measures with respect to accountability. And what fits the political cycle? Well, if you give a bigger wage increase, you give a bigger pension, that's going to push up taxes, right? And municipal politicians don't want that. So what do we think has happened over the last 50 years that is really driving this result? Instead of, right, making concessions that are economic, local governments have opted to make concessions that protect officers in their ability to kill civilians, right? So at the bargaining table, they're handing over things that make the public less safe. So what's my big policy takeaway? The employer, local governments, should be coming to the table and making public health, public safety, particularly for the Black population and Indigenous peoples, front and center in the bargaining conversation.
You use the word accountability in that answer, though, and this seems to be one of those areas where accountability is tricky. On the one hand, sure, the police budget is the largest line item in any municipality's budget. In the city of Toronto, it's more than $1 billion alone. But they don't run the police. It's the Police Services Board that actually is responsible for overseeing police actions, but they're not elected. So we can't throw them out if we don't like the way they've handled things. And there may be some provincial policy involved here, but the province doesn't control the Ontario Provincial Police, let's say, for example, either. So accountability, kind of tricky here. How do we know where to go to try to get ultimate accountability?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually much easier to give policy recommendations in the American space. As a Canadian, I think you need to turn pretty much in equal parts, right, to the province and to your police board and your municipality, right? Because without those three bodies acting in tandem, we're not going to be able to change things. And so pressure needs to be applied across the board. And, I think we've seen time and time again that those three bodies are going to have a tendency to pass the buck between them. And that is a political tactic. And that is something that the public, to be honest, just shouldn't put up with.
What does your research tell you, or where does it direct you in terms of these three now very famous words we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks? Defund the police.
Yeah, I mean, as an academic, I think it's extremely important, right? It's our job to take ideas and to try to help turn them into something that we can do. So when I think about defunding the police, in terms of the rationale, right? If you are a Black Canadian, if you are an Indigenous person, we know that you're not being treated equally, right? We know that you are being made less safe oftentimes by this institution. So why do a lot of those folks want to limit funding there? Well, you're right. We have limited tax dollars, and do you really want them primarily going to an institution that is not treating you the same as your neighbor, right? That I think that's the origin. Now, what can it look like practically? Well, police departments have core roles that they'll need to fill. But if this institution is failing people of color, right, you can say, well, maybe you can have another institution that isn't, right? And for example, we can take some mental health work that officers do and shift that out to institutions that don't have that same history. Or you can even get creative. I saw an economist the other day talking through what you could do with respect to traffic, right? We've to some degree taken for granted that traffic stops are done by officers, but there's nothing that would stop a truly creative local government from actually creating something independent and separating those two roles. So I don't think it's about shutting down departments altogether, but it's about moving responsibilities to institutions that will treat Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples the same as white Canadians.
Rob, do you have any idea whether or not police unions across North America are aware of your work, or whether you've sent it to them to make them aware of it?
Yeah, I've chatted with some folks, and to be honest, conversations have been very constructive. The labor movement, I think, is working very actively here. There's been some outreach within Canada. I think a really important historical piece of context here is that the labor movement is a force for tremendous good. But it has had difficulties, right? It has had struggles. You don't need to jump back that long ago to a time when locals were segregated, right? Where one half of the American labor movement was segregationist and the other half was in favor of civil rights. And they had a reckoning. And so I think that, right, one of the big pieces here is that there are going to be people within police unions who want to tackle these problems, who believe they should be treated the same by the law, who care about the rights of Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples. And those folks, right, can get involved in their union. They can change the policy, and they can make a difference.
Do you know them? Do you know who they are?
I wish I knew more of them. I know a handful, but it is not my place, right? Unions are democratic organizations, and it is up to those members to carve out space in their own organization and make their voice heard.
Fascinating stuff. Rob, we're really grateful you could spare some time for us from Victoria, British Columbia. Thanks so much.
Oh, an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, June 17th, 2020. If you've tried to buy a bicycle in the past couple of months, you'll know it's become a very hot commodity in the COVID-19 context. Tomorrow, we'll explore what role cycling might play in our transportation network going forward. Also, we'll look at the notion that the way we design our cities perpetuates the inequality so many are taking to the streets to protest against. Hope you'll be with us for those conversations. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.